Howdy, howdy. Chester here, making this video to show my cistern setup, how I've done it, as well as give my thoughts on this cistern in particular, as I could not find info on it other than their customer service page. I didn't see any links or reviews for it, so I'll go over that along with some of my thoughts and why I did what I did. It's a 1,500 gallon cistern. I ordered it from Home Depot's website. I had it shipped to the closest Home Depot. Took about 2 weeks to get there. I got two 12-inch risers that go with it, along with the mounting ring and the lid. The stock black lids that come with the cistern will not fit this riser. Here's a sticker, VPC 1,500 gallon multi-use single compartment tank. This is for a gravity feed cistern. It's at the top end of my property. It feeds down the ditch, down to the lower property. This will be filled by a well. There'll be a float switch in the cistern here to control the well pump. So the reason I chose a plastic cistern such as this over a concrete one was for a couple reasons. Main reason being no access to get a concrete tank up here. This is a skid trail coming up from the lower end of the property. Bringing the excavator up here is difficult. Getting a concrete tank up here would be nearly impossible. Also, I'll go over how I hooked up the plumbing in this tank later, but with a concrete tank, it's much harder to tie your supply line and drain line into the cistern. You have to bore through the concrete as well as seal it. There are options for doing that. None of them were what I was looking for or particularly clean. I would have had to buy and or rent the tools to bore the holes, and the ways of sealing the pipe coming through the concrete are doable, but in my mind less than adequate. So for me, that settled on a plastic tank. There's a number of these plastic tanks, multiple manufacturers. For me, it had to be obviously for potable water, since this is a cistern. So that ruled out using a less expensive septic tank, which it would be the same size, shape, and is made in the same mold as this blue one, but they're not rated for potable water. Given the plastics, there's the possibility they can leach into the water supply. Also, the septic tanks are not usually very thick plastic. I've seen a rock not much bigger than a softball go right through the side of a plastic tank when it fell down the bank into and fell against the plastic septic tank. It knocked a hole right in it. It was not a very big rock, not going very fast, but septic tanks tend to be very thin, brittle plastic. There's also a lot of the white, translucent white tanks for water. With the same ribbed design. The problem I found with all of those was they were not recommended that you could bury them and then empty all the water. The manufacturer required, depending on the manufacturer, that you leave at least 30% of the water in there to help support the tank. Otherwise, the weight of the earth around it and the moisture in the soil around would cave the tank in. This blue tank and these others, translucent blue tanks, are the only ones I found that were A, for potable water, B, could be buried at all, but more so than that, could be buried, and once they're buried, could be drained completely empty. It doesn't do me much good if I can't empty my cistern all the way. This cistern is approximately 5 foot wide 11 foot long, and 6 foot tall. It weighs somewhere around 600 pounds. I was able to haul it up here myself with the skid steer and set it in the hole. Once again, a concrete tank, I wouldn't have been able to do that. With the risers and the green lid you see there and the tank, it cost me $3,200 to have it shipped to the nearest Home Depot. Once it was there, it's about a 3-hour round trip for me to go get it. I could have had them deliver it to the property. They wanted several $100s. I figured 3 hours of my time was worth going to get it. In emailing back and forth with this company's customer service, one thing that was noted was that even though this can be emptied completely once it is backfilled, while backfilling it needs to be full. I actually broke some pipes because I did not realize how much the tank would move as I was backfilling. Or rather, even before I backfilled, when I went to fill it with water, the tank got about 2 inches shorter and about 1.5 inches wider on either side when it was full of water. If you look down here at the bottom, I emptied the tank again because I need to do some more work inside. And when you empty it, it pulls away from the dirt about 5/8 of an inch. There's only about a foot of dirt around the bottom right now. I'm gonna get inside the cistern, show what I did for plumbing, as well as the mistake I made that led to me figuring out that this tank actually changes shape depending on how much water is in it. I'm down inside the tank. Audio is probably going to be terrible. This is looking down towards the other end. You can see my inlet pipe that comes in along the bottom and then goes up. That works. Having it empty at the top of the tank works as an anti-siphon so that water cannot flow back out through the inlet pipe. Also, having the inlet on the opposite end of the outlet, make sure that the water is continually getting moved around the tank rather than having the inlet and the outlet right next to each other and one end of the tank gets stale. This small pipe here, the 1 inch, is the inlet that runs along the floor and then just goes up and ends. The water sprays out the top there. This is the inlet. This is what I've done a little different than most people have done. You can see my bulkhead fitting come through. It's a 2-inch pipe fitting, required a 3-inch hole. Go through a thread adapter, 90-degree 2-inch ball valve. This is an elbow I have on here just to try and get the last little bit of water out. It's not glued. I can take it off if I decide not to do it. A mistake I made before I backfilled the tank at all, you can see I have the dirt filled up maybe a foot around the perimeter. To turn this valve on and off, obviously you have to have a handle for it as it's 6 feet underwater. Previously I had a handle mounted on the valve here. The handle then went all the way up to the manhole access and was anchored to the side of the manhole access. You can see where I cut away part of the plastic to do that. That was a rigid pipe going up there, and when I filled the cistern, I found out that even though the tank itself didn't move or settle further in the ground, the shape of the tank changed. The sides bulged out, and then the top came down about 2 inches. What that did was it shoved the vertical pipe that was mounted on this valve and anchored at the top, and it broke this valve off right here at the thread adapter. So I just got done taking the old valve assembly out, and I had to chip out the broken thread adapter out of the bulkhead fitting. I realized having the valve on the inside is an odd way to do it. However, I did have my reasons, which I'll go through. First reason being, in these ribs, they look fairly wide, But if you're using a 2-inch pipe, it requires a 3-inch hole, and that flange on the bulkhead fitting is over 4 inches. As you can see, there is no area on any of the sides big enough for a bulkhead fitting. These places right on the end where the ribs come together are the only place you can fit a bulkhead that big. Because of that, I had to come up to the bottom of the tank. Because I was putting the drain line, or rather the outfeed line, in the bottom, I put the supply in the bottom so all my plumbing ran together. One of my concerns that prompted me to put the valve on the inside was if the tank is to settle or shift with time, the fitting directly after the tank is the one that's most likely going to break, which means it would most likely break before the valve if I were to put the valve accessible from the outside of the cistern. Even if I were to put it outside the cistern, effectively right on the other side of this wall, I still have to have a way to access it, which means some sort of long handle and a pipe going down to it, or some sort of key to turn it off. That would have to be a foot to 18 inches out there to get out from under the tank. And then if the tank were to settle or shift, it would most likely break the fitting before it got to the valve, rendering the valve useless for shutting the tank off. So having it inside the tank means that if the outlet pipe breaks due to the tank settling, the valve is before the break, and either way, whether the tank is outside or inside, you have to have a long-handled valve to turn it on and off. My valve is just more valve handle. It's just a piece of aluminum pipe that I cut a notch that fits around that handle. Back outside the tank here, as you can see, this is the same footprint as would be called a normal septic tank. However, it's made out of a potable water material. The walls are also significantly thicker, which allows it to be buried and then drained completely without collapsing on itself. I talked previously about how I had to put the bulkhead fittings out the bottom in order to find a flat big enough. At the top of the tank, there are these large flats, similar to a septic tank, where you could put your bulkhead fittings in and out. For me, that wasn't an option for a couple reasons. One, this is a gravity feed system, so the well will keep the tank full, but then gravity will supply the rest of the property out of this cistern. If I put the outlet pipe going through this flat up on the top end of the tank, it's only about 8 inches, maybe a foot down from the very top. I then have a siphon effect going where it has to siphon the water up a pipe on the inside of the tank, over this high spot, back down, and then down the ditch. That can work for a while, but once you run the cistern empty, you lose the siphon and then you have to reestablish it, and you get an airlock at the top end of where the pipe comes through at the highest point. Another reason that wouldn't work in my situation is because my frost line is about 4 feet down. So if I have a small pipe, even a 2-inch pipe, that shallow in the ground, it will freeze, and at that point it's pointless even doing it. So that's why I put the bulkhead fittings in the bottom versus this flat on top. This flat on top is rather pointless in a cistern, in my opinion, because of the need to siphon it from the bottom of the tank to almost the highest point in the tank to then go down. And then also in this situation, it would bring the pipe up above the frost line significantly. So far, I've been pretty impressed with this tank, and I think it was still the best choice given what options I had. This is the circle that I cut out when one of the bulkhead fittings. Unlike some of the other tanks, the ones that are not made to be buried empty, or to be emptied once they're buried, this is 1/2 inch, 9/16 thick wall. The plastic septic tanks I've seen, as well as the other water tanks, are significantly thinner. I think that's part of the reason they can't be buried empty, or they can't be emptied after they're buried. About my only concern or gripe with this is the lack of flat spots to put bulkhead fittings through. Like I said, there's these flats on each end. The other end is a mirror image of this one. However, that flat is so high in the tank, it's not useful for a cistern application. Also, a cistern like this that met my criteria for potable water, being able to be buried, being able to be emptied completely once it's buried, as well as something I could get up to this site. This tank is the only one that fit the bill. Having said that, it was fairly bit more expensive, probably about $1,000 more than another plastic tank that I would have to leave water in versus draining all the way. A 2,000 gallon concrete tank would have been about the same price delivered down to the lower end of the property, but like I said, I had no effective way to get it up here. So even if I could have gotten a slightly bigger concrete tank for the same price, it wouldn't have done me any good. Now that I've gotten that valve replaced down inside the cistern, I'm going to go back to bedding the tank and backfilling it. In order to do that, I have to fill it with water again. So I'll be spending the next day hauling water to fill it. And then I will continue backfilling and bedding the pipe. As you can see, my soil is very rocky. So I'm taking the dirt and rock, running it through this screen, using the fines to bed the pipe and to pack right around the cistern, and then putting the rest of the rock and soil just in the hole, making sure to keep all the rocks away from the cistern itself and use the fine material to bed the cistern and the pipe. I hope this was helpful. This is my way of doing it. I realize the valve on the inside is a little bit odd. I hope I did a reasonable explanation as to why I went that route. I will plan to make more videos and explain more of this process, including the well itself and then the rest of the water system on the property.